Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the International Association for Impact Assessment virtual forum series, Think Big, 2050 City Megagrowth, Assessing and Addressing the Impacts. I'm Heather Goldstone, Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate Research Center and your moderator for today. We began this Think Big virtual forum with some big picture thinking about the role of impact assessment in helping the world's growing cities confront and perhaps become part of the solutions to some of the biggest challenges we face globally, including the climate and biodiversity crises, social injustice, and rapid technological change. In this session, our presenters will delve more deeply into challenges and opportunities facing cities on the African continent, starting with Julian Baskin. Julian works at the Cities Alliance Secretariat as the principal urban advisor supporting the design and implementation of country programs, including in Uganda, Mozambique, Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Liberia. He is a town and regional planner with over 30 years of experience in urban programming with a focus on participatory planning, slum upgrading, and affordable housing. Today, he's going to speak to the need for new and different ways of supporting the growth and development of African cities, which are urbanizing fast and informally and are vulnerable to climate change. He sees a need for investment in resilient infrastructure, investment that eliminates backlogs and enables future households to settle in the right places. Local governments cannot do this alone. A partnership is needed that includes organizations of the urban poor and different ways of delivering infrastructure, leveraging small community contractors. And that's what Julian's going to talk to us about now.
Thank you for the honor of your time. My name is Julian Baskin. I'm the Principal Urban Advisor at the Cities Alliance, based in Brussels on a very cold day. Today, I'll speak to you about the growth of African cities and the need for resilient infrastructure for the urban poor. The Cities Alliance was formed in 1999 under the patronage of Nelson Mandela. It is a global partnership fighting urban poverty and promoting the role of cities in sustainable development. Africa is experiencing the fastest rate of urbanization in history. Its slums are growing by 60,000 people per day. Over the last year, the slums have grown by 22 million people, the equivalent of a Lagos and Kinshasa combined. By 2040, African cities will be home to an additional 350 million people. Much of this growth is taking place in small and medium-sized towns. But while the cities are growing, city governments are not in a position to respond. One of the biggest problems they face is they don't have the human resources they need to manage cities. A recent study undertaken by the Cities Alliance identified that on average, African cities have only 28% of the human resources they need to effectively manage the city. Other problems relate to distorted incentives and the inadequate employment structure. Another problem faced is the inappropriate planning and housing approaches currently being adopted. For example, this 1,500 site housing project took 5 years and huge resources to develop. To develop the project, it underwent a process of identifying land, planning the land, establishing a township, servicing the land, then building housing on the land, and then settling the land. A process that is very long relative to the rate of urban growth and urbanization. In Mozambique, for example, it was estimated in 2016 that the country needed 80,000 service sites, but the formal planning system provided only 5,000 sites. This gap between 5,000 and 80,000 is indicative of the gap between the informal settlement of cities and the formal settlement of cities. By 2040, 60% by 2040, 6% of the population in Africa will live in urban areas. This is a positive thing. No country has reached middle income status without urbanizing. For example, Ghana, when it reached 50% urban population, became a middle income country. But this relationship between city growth and economic development is not automatic. Many diseconomies are starting to appear. For example, 60% of the population live in informal settlements, settlements without access to energy and basic services. Rather than finding jobs in the cities, the greatest source of employment is the informal economy. 93% of new jobs are found in the informal sector. 61% of all jobs in African cities are in the informal sector. Over and above informality, there's the challenge of climate change and the environment. Climate change will hit Africa hard. It is estimated that there will be a decrease in water availability of 20 to 30%. It is also warming faster than the global average by 3 to 4 degrees. And over and above climate change, because there is no electricity, 90% of energy that is being used within African cities is based on biomass, which is essentially wood, resulting in mass deforestation. The context of African city growth is informality, unplanned growth. If, for example, we take the example of Nampula, Mozambique, the city grew at 5.7%, which means the city doubles in 12 years. If you look at the picture, the red symbolizes the informal growth of the city. You can see by far the majority of the growth occurred in an informal manner. But when we talk about informality, it essentially means that people settle where they can find land. And often the land that they find is in vulnerable places, on shorelines, along river banks, floodplains, and the like. Informality also has environmentally devastating effects. Due to the lack of solid waste management, when there's a need to rid the settlement of waste, the waste is often dumped in drainage lines, being washed out to the local lagoons and into the sea. The need to rely on wood means mass deforestation, and the use of charcoal means pollution of the city. The lack of public transport means that people are dependent on two-stroke motorbikes. All this is interconnected. Uncollected solid waste clogs drains and natural waterways. This increased flooding in rainy seasons creates floods that fundamentally undermine the informal economy, undermining people's ability to survive in the city and deepening poverty. Within this context, there are competing visions. The first vision is the world-class city. The idea that you can build on top of the existing informal settlements a world-class, high-rise, compact city. But to make these cities happen, it relies on the mass relocation of households. Every year, 5 million people suffer this cruel fate. The destruction of houses and the displacement of people from their economic activities results in deepening poverty. Relocation is the opposite of development. The other competing vision is the inclusive city vision, a vision based on active citizenship. Here we have 4 photographs that show the essence of what an inclusive city means. At the top left, we see communities living in Mbali, mapping and profiling their settlements, developing plans of their slum areas, and creating a situation where their previously unmatched settlements become part and parcel of the city, increasing their residence rights and citizenship rights within that city. Planning that is completely open and participatory, including everyone, including children. In the bottom, we have a growing partnership in the city of Monrovia that brings together the national ministries, the local government officials, and slum dweller communities to work together and to find the common ground to enable things to happen within the poorest areas of the city. And in the bottom right, we have savings groups that are typical within African cities. They're savings groups that are used to ensure that the urban poor save money needed to invest in their own income-generating activities, but also to invest in the city itself. Fundamental to resilient infrastructure is aligned policy and planning. To align policy and planning and to ensure that people settle where they need to be settled and not in the most vulnerable areas, it's important to have in place the right institutional structures. These institutional structures start right in the settlement areas themselves, with the development of settlement forums. It is within these settlement forums that slum upgrading plans are made and where community infrastructure needs are identified. You also need in every city a municipal development forum, a forum that brings together the various stakeholders of the city, including the urban poor and others, to develop the city development strategies and develop the land expansion planning required to enable that people do not simply settle informally, but settle on land identified and allocated for settlement. And finally, every country needs to have a national urban forum where the national urban policies can be developed, policies that are needed to leverage investments into slum upgrading and municipal development. It is within the frame of national governments creating enabling policies for cities to deliver services to an active citizenship where the solutions to Africa's rapid urbanization will be found. We need to do things completely differently. We need to ensure that people settle in the right places. Settling people in the right place is the first step towards resilience. But we need to move away from forced evictions. Where people already exist in very vulnerable spaces, we need to start the process of negotiating voluntary relocations. Relocations that happen over time and with the necessary safeguards. Relocations where people understand what is happening and are part and parcel of that process. We need to do things completely differently in terms of how we ensure that there is no corruption. And the best way to ensure there's no corruption is to ensure there's community ownership of the infrastructure. In Uganda, the Municipal Development Forum oversights road infrastructure contracts. They believe the road is theirs as it serves their community, and they want to make sure that the road is built exactly as it is planned. In Ghana, you have community engagement, looking at the various technological solutions to the sanitation problems they face. So when the right sanitation option is chosen, the people understand why and what it means to scale up and to ensure that everyone gets access to it. The huge and growing infrastructure and essential service deficits must be closed. The vast majority of cities and towns in Africa face two major challenges. The first challenge is the huge backlog of service investments required to upgrade existing slums and informal settlements. The second challenge is to make sure that there is service land up front to meet the demands of increasing rapid urbanization. If these two challenges are not addressed, chaotic urban sprawl, slums, and crippling informality will increasingly characterize urban development. But we need to do this taking into account a wide range of different issues. The first issue we need to respond to is the climate emergency. In closing the infrastructure and services gap, it must be achieved in a manner that mitigates as much as possible the adverse impacts of climate change. African cities must climate-proof all infrastructure and service investments and actively accelerate the race to resilience. African cities must focus on supporting investments in urban nature-based solutions, as well as an inclusive and green development. Slum upgrading and responding to the climate emergency are not two different things. They need to be completely integrated together. Over on top of that, African cities have become increasingly unfriendly to women and youth. All infrastructure and service investments must be designed and delivered in a manner that is women-friendly and promotes youth employment through labor-intensive and circular economy approaches. Furthermore, by far the majority of people are pedestrians in African cities. African cities are walking cities, but they are not walkable. Investments in sustainable mobility need to factor into account walking and cycling and public transportation that promotes equitable access to opportunities. In building this infrastructure, we need to look at different service delivery models. It is estimated that at today's value, we will need $850 billion to provide the infrastructure that is needed, or $25 billion per annum. To deliver this infrastructure, we need to support the use of public-private partnerships. We need to fully exploit the potential of the informal economy. We need to engage with community-based groups and NGOs in the provision and maintenance of infrastructure and services. And we need to integrate informal and small-scale systems of delivery into formal systems. Another expression of the going massive small principle, an important route for cities and towns becoming transformative. We also need to look at new mechanisms for financing small infrastructure projects. The Cities Alliance has experience in establishing what we call community upgrading funds. A community upgrading fund enables communities to identify within the frame of their settlement forums their infrastructure needs and to make application to the fund for monies required to build small infrastructure projects. The Cities Alliance can attest that using the CUF and using community contractors, infrastructure is able to be built at scale and at much cheaper rates than would be if it were put out to some form of public tender. We also need to make sure that the urban poor become the champions of the natural environments. In Uganda, we have one of the huge settlements of Kinwataka right next to a wetland. Because the settlement does not have any services, the wetland is used as a point of sanitation. It's used as a point of dumping all solid waste and used as a toilet. By investing in the slum upgrading of the settlement, the pressure on the wetland is reduced. In this way, you can start to restore the wetland so they can provide the type of protection against flooding that is required. The long-term sustainability will be to ensure that through the schools and through the curricula, children become the champions of the wetland, recognizing the importance of the wetland in protecting their settlements against flooding and other disasters. And as the cities grow, we're going to need to superimpose on top of the city some larger infrastructure. The question is, how do you superimpose infrastructure on top of land that is already developed? This can only be done if we really entrench and strengthen our safeguards. Currently, the safeguards do not necessarily include aspects of climate change, and we need to make sure that our safeguards look into the question of making sure our infrastructure is climate-proofed. But most importantly, it does not take into account the fact that people are settled informally. Many of the safeguards are implemented through the government's own eminent domain policies, where the government will identify the people who will be needed to be removed from the right-of-way, and they will, through some formula, identify how much money each household will be compensated. But this compensation almost always is based on land ownership and the quality of the housing on top of the land. If communities don't own the land and because of their very precarious situation only build low-quality housing, they then receive almost no compensation at all, and are thus forced to move out of the area and find even worse land than they were in before, further entrenching their poverty and further entrenching the dysfunctionality of the city. The future of African cities is going to rely on using the infrastructure projects to start the formalization of the city. And to do this, we need to make sure that safeguards are there to ensure the rights of everyone, so that everyone benefits and have the resources to invest within the city so that we can start the normalization of the city process. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julian. Our next presenter is Yaw Amoyaw-Osei. Yaw is an environmental and social assessment specialist with over 30 years of experience as a former director for impact assessment at EPA Ghana and a full-time practitioner, delivering over 70 impact assessment services as CEO of CEHRT Consult. Yaw is both a former president of IAIA and the IAIA Ghana affiliate. And he's going to draw our attention today to the particular problem of informal development of road and railway reservations in growing cities. This annexation scars the landscape and creates unsafe and unhygienic conditions. Yaw argues that municipal authorities must comply with environmental assessment regulations in land use planning and grant of development approvals to eliminate the audacious annexation of these reservations.
The impact of urban growth and annexation of road and railway reservations, Sakumono Estate, Tamagana. My name is Yaw Amoyaw-Osei. Yes, CEO of Center for Environment and Health Research and Training, Ghana. Road and railway reservations are the easily abused urban landscape for informal settlements. The pervasive annexation plagues a scarce urban landscape. The authorities look oblivious to the requirements of the environmental assessment regulations that can help eliminate the audacious annexation of such reservations. The outline of my presentation covers an introduction, then the construction of the main Sakumono Estate road reconstruction, annexation of the road reservation, and then annexation of railway reservation, characteristics of informal development in reservations, climate, safety, and health implications, and recommendations, both general and specific. Now, introduction. Tema is the leading seaport and industrial city in Ghana. Sakumono Estate is among well-developed satellite communities to absorb Tema's urban expanding population. A four-lane Nungwa-Lashibi Road and the Accra-Tema Railway Line all pass through the Sakumono Estates. Road and railway reservations, like any linear infrastructure, provide adequate corridor for future expansion, ample space for maintenance, line infrastructure servicing, and unobstructed access and public safety. More so, reservations are essential planning provisions with statutory dimensions. For example, for road drain construction, for utility lines, example, water supply pipelines, transmission lines for electricity, telecommunication cable lines, and road shoulder and holding area for breakdown vehicles. Have here a Google Earth image of near intact section of the road reservation after the construction of the Nungwa-Lashibi Road at Sakumono Estate. And then we compare this with what we have now, Google image of the section of the road reservation that is completely annexed. And you see the difference. Then we also have here a picture of the same west section of the reservation completely taken over by informal structures, including trading on portions of the walkway. For railway lines reservation annexation, you have the informal structures line the railway reservation with high population density, and the low line sections used for disposal of sewage and garbage. Then you also have this section showing informal structures under power transmission towers and then transmission lines along the railway reservation. Then on the right is a reservation overtaken by informal structures where we have formal residential buildings in the background. Annexation of reservations for informal use. These reservations are among urban land space most susceptible to informal, unauthorized, and haphazard developments. They start as small structures at some obscure corner in the reservation, but with the municipal authorities turning a blind eye, no sooner others join in a rapid succession to establish improvised structures. Characteristics of the informal development and settlements include the following. Most are occupied by people unable to afford the cost of renting houses or informal spaces in buildings. They resort to cheap improvised structures for working areas and homes. The structures, they double as home, especially for those in the railway reservations. The structures are strong under power tension lines. The structures are crammed together and also close to the road or the rail track. Some commercial trading activities tend to obstruct even the walkway by pedestrians. And no water provision, no drain provision, no toilet provision. The climate safety and health implications identified include exposure to electromagnetic radiation and accidental collapse of power line tower or overhead power lines under extreme weather conditions, for example, windstorms and rainstorms. The risk of flooding in the absence of drains to channel runoff, given the haphazard and cramped structures. Unhygienic conditions, example, liquid waste of undisclosed content disposed of indiscriminately. Source of diseases and infections from poor sanitation and spread of diarrhea diseases, mosquitoes and malaria, cholera, and so on. Solid waste burning and air pollution problems. Sources of fire outbreak affecting even nearby formal residences. Now, recommendations are in two parts, the general recommendations and the specific case to Sakumono Estate. Now, for the general, the pervasive annexation of reservations carrying the Sakumono landscape is a common phenomenon plaguing all urban reservations. Now, the general recommendations include that the planning authority must subject its housing or estate or community or township development to the required environmental assessment and implement it, just like private sector developers do, in compliance with the environmental assessment regulations. The EPA must exercise its enforcement mandate to ensure municipal authorities comply as all others do. EPA's enforcement will compel municipal authorities to follow through their mandate to grant prior development approval, which would eliminate the audacious annexation of urban reservations. The Department of Urban Roads must discharge its mandate to implement EIA-approved road projects and related reservations, liaison with relevant municipal authorities. For railway line reservations, the Ghana Railway Development Authority should be accountable for maintaining sound, safe, and sustainable management of reservations in line with the respective EIA outcomes in conjunction with the municipal authorities. Now, recommendations for the Sakumono Estate specific case. The planning scheme for the Sakumono Estate ought to have been subjected to a strategic environmental assessment, SEA, and an environmental management plan, EMP, implemented for sustainable management of the community, including reservations, roads, and rail. An EMP implementation would have protected the right of way and the reservation for the orderly development in future. Example, for power line construction, water pipelines, telecommunication network installation, drain provision, and walkways, among others. Given the present situation, the utilized and unutilized sections of road and rail reservations should be subjected to an environmental audit and an environmental management plan prepared for the sustainable management of the current temporary use state of the reservations. The present occupiers should be given conditional or restricted use rights, renewable every year. Relevant social and sanitary facilities must be provided for them in a temporary context, to justify the municipal levy collected from occupiers. The annexed reservation sections must be properly decommissioned in line with the EA regulations when due for future designated development or use. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Yaw. Our final presenter in this session is Bryony Walmsley. Bryony has over 40 years experience as an ESIA practitioner covering most development fields across sub-Saharan Africa. Since 2004, she has focused on capacity building, institutional strengthening, independent ESIA review, the development of EA guidelines and manuals, and compliance auditing. She was elected to the IAIA Board of Directors in 2021. Her presentation today will explore recent research into the effectiveness of national ESIA laws and development bank environmental and social systems. Research that shows that while these safeguards are present in theory, there are many shortcomings in their application during implementation. And she'll explain how these issues are exacerbated in urban environments and in the context of climate change.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bryony Walmsley, and I'm presenting a paper based on some research I did for Cities Alliance a couple of years ago on what role do environmental and social safeguards play in the development of climate-resilient infrastructure projects in cities. So I'm going to look, first of all, at the environmental and social safeguard systems, both at national level and within the development finance institutions, some of their strengths and weaknesses in theory and practice, and then offer some conclusions and recommendations. So the research question is, do the existing environmental and social safeguard systems work effectively in the context of informality, infrastructure development, and climate change? And I think it's quite useful to put it the other way around and say, how would our cities look without any environmental and social safeguards being in place or being enforced? This is perhaps a cynical view, but would they look the same or even worse, or would they even look better? And that is a point to be discussed. So as I mentioned, there are two interrelated safeguard systems, both the national laws, both on ESIA and on Strategic Environmental Assessment, SEA, and then the development finance institutions, who most of them have some sort of environmental and social appraisal systems, and their projects are approved and loan negotiations are based on the successful completion of an ESIA report. But they tend to rely on national authority management and administration systems for project compliance. So the first question and the conclusions from my research were to answer the question, are national ESIA requirements adequate to address climate change and informality in our cities? And the answer here is that yes, in theory, mostly, legislation is in place. But there are many problems in the actual application of the legislation. Most ESIA legislation, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, predates climate change policies and action plans. So there are almost no requirements or legal requirements or guidance on doing climate change risk assessments. Secondly, social aspects are often not included in the definition of the term environment. And even when they are, what we mean by social is not unpacked Does it include health and gender? And if it's not actually specified, sometimes these aspects tend to get overlooked. It's also quite challenging to do effective social research, particularly in informal areas, especially when there's perhaps illegal squatter settlements or illegal migrants in an area. People don't want to be seen. So that's quite a challenge of doing effective social research, particularly in urban environments. And then another big problem is that resettlement action plans are often done separately from the ESIA and often later, so that the findings of the resettlement action plans are not actually incorporated into the ESIA documents at all. And this can also pose a problem. Furthermore, there's a lack of expertise relating to climate change and social issues within most environmental authorities. So environmental and social impact assessments lack a meaningful climate change risk assessment in SIA on the basis of the fact that the right questions are not being asked. There's a lack of rigorous review of those ESIA reports. There's inadequate compliance auditing by government authorities during project implementation as well. What happens here then is that there might be a very, very good ESIA and ESMP, but if there is no compliance being enforced, contractors tend to do what they want. Then we come to the development finance institutions. Many cities in Africa are experiencing a massive boom in infrastructure building, most of which are being funded by DFIs. Now, these DFIs, most of them, but definitely not all, have environmental and social safeguard systems in place, which aim to protect the public, particularly the most poor and most vulnerable, from unequal distribution of costs and benefits, promote equality, health, well-being, protect the environment from damage, encourage sustainable development, and ultimately through the funding, the ultimate aim is to improve the quality of life of the beneficiaries. Unfortunately, there are many, many projects being funded by DFIs who do not have environmental and social safeguard systems in place and who rely on national environmental authorities to apply those safeguards. And as we saw in the first conclusion, there are many weaknesses, particularly in the implementation stage within those national authorities. So that's a challenge. So some more challenges within the DFI safeguards and the application of them is that often scoping reports are not usually reviewed. The reviews really only start at the ESIA stage. So the actual scoping and the terms of reference for the full ESIAs are not critically examined in terms of the DFI system, which is an oversight because the quality of the ESIA report really depends on how well the issues were scoped in the first place. Another big problem is that the ESIA is being done too early in the process. It tends to be done in parallel with sort of conceptual pre-feasibility studies, and the aim here is to tick the box to get the funding. But the problem is that because it's being done too early in the process, it is overlooking, well, first of all, it's not being based on a detailed design. And what happens, and the ESIA report is appraisal by DFI staff, is not always as rigorous as it should be. So what happens when the ESIA is done too early in the process? A lot happens between the ESIA and when the project gets started, including project scope creep, including, and sometimes many years can elapse between the finalization of the ESIA and project start. And in that time, environmental and particularly social conditions could have changed. So there's a big time lag between the ESIA and project implementation. So sometimes the ESIA actually bears no resemblance to the final project on the ground at all. This is a real weakness. Another big problem I found was that the cost of mitigation is not accurately calculated or reflected in the loan agreements. The loan agreements tend to have a one-liner which says implementation of the ESMP with an amount, but there's no breakdown of that amount. And what I found in my research, not just for Citizen Alliance, but past research, is that there's no accounting for expenditure on environmental and social mitigation measures at all. Contractors will maybe account for all the cement and every bit of rebar, but when it comes to environmental and social measures, they're not individually costed or accounted for. Finally, there's inconsistencies in procurement. For example, the ESMP is not included in the tender documents. And we all know what happens if the tenderer or the contractor does not price for all the requirements under the Environmental and Social Management Plan, they won't be done. Project implementation and monitoring and compliance auditing by DFIs is weak. And this is because of capacity. There's so many projects, it's quite time consuming. And so there's a reliance, an over-reliance, I might say, on national environmental authorities. But we know that the national environmental authorities don't have the capacity, they don't have the vehicles, they don't have the time or the budgets to do the necessary implementation, monitoring and compliance auditing, which they are required to do in law. So again, here is a big gap or weakness in the application of the system. Just like to mention here that another environmental assessment system, the strategic environmental assessment, and whether or not, as part of the national safeguard system, whether or not this is being applied on projects, particularly in urban environments in Africa. So quite a lot of recent environmental legislation in sub-Saharan Africa now includes a requirement to conduct an SEA of policies, plans and programs. And the question is, what is an SEA? An SEA is not just a large EIA. It follows similar steps, but it's quite a different application. It's a very proactive application, and it looks at a range of analytical and participatory approaches to integrate environmental considerations into policies, plans and programs, and evaluate the interlinkages with socioeconomic considerations. SEA can also be applied to sectoral developments, for example, the telecoms industry, or it can be applied where there's concentrated development in defined areas or regions, for example, a concentration of wind or solar farms in a particular area. Rather than doing individual EIAs, it would be much better to look at the cumulative impacts of these multiple projects through the lens of a strategic environmental assessment. If you look at this diagram here as well, you can see that environmental impact assessment, when it's applied to individual projects, has a very low potential to influence sustainable development. Whereas when you're dealing with national policies, you're dealing with national development plans, sector programs, or even regional, provincial, local authority land use plans and zoning plans and municipal plans, the application of SEA at that higher level of policy instrument tends to have much greater potential to influence sustainable development. So there are many benefits of doing strategic environmental assessment. It allows for alignment with national and municipal policy objectives and with international goals such as the SDGs or other international obligations. It allows for a range of potential scenarios to be evaluated. And I think this is particularly important in the municipal environment, which is highly dynamic, and it may be being affected by significant shifts in climate change. So you can analyse the development plans in terms of a number of climate change and city development or economic development scenarios to see what would be the potential impacts if this were to materialise over a period of time. SEA is also done at a very early stage of policy, plan and programme development. So as I said, it's very proactive and it can provide early warning of risks and cumulative effects and particularly unintended consequences which may not have been considered. And by its nature, it encourages a multidisciplinary approach to policy, plan and programme development at all tiers of government, both national, regional and local. It promotes active stakeholder involvement, which I'll come to in the next slide. And it also can provide the framework for future ESIAs and ESMPs by setting environmental quality objectives and targets, setting constraints based on carrying capacity as well. So it's not instead of ESIA, it can provide a very useful framework within which future ESIAs and ESMPs are conducted. And by setting these environmental quality objectives and targets, makes decision making a lot easier around those things. So, for example, in an urban area, you might have some industrial zones, and you may want to set environmental quality objectives on air quality. And that can then be a fixed objective, as I say, with the active stakeholder involvement coming up with those quality objectives. And then once those objectives have been reached, then that would mean that no further industry can be allowed without some significant mitigation. It identifies key performance indicators to help you assess the success of your policy plan or program, particularly in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. So yes, as I said, it's very participatory, and it involves people actively in setting some of the visions and objectives and environmental quality objectives of what you're trying to achieve. So not just with the formal sector, but also with the informal sector. Not just with local government, but with national government. NGOs and civil society organisations, experts and institutions. And the reason why it needs to be so participatory is because a lot of the actions that come out of the SEA in the strategic management plan need to be implemented by a number of different players, and that could be within any one of these stakeholder groups. And they need to have bought into the process in order for them to carry out those mitigation measures. So the conclusion 3, to answer the question, are SEAs being used to evaluate policies, plans and programs in the urban environment, and are they being effective? Well, the answer is that they're rarely applied by either national environmental authorities or the DFIs, even though they are prescribed in some countries in the law, and most DFI safeguard systems also prescribe them. So very few are being done, and this could be because of country ownership issues, particularly if they're being done by overseas consultants funded by an overseas agency, and the country doesn't really have the ownership or doesn't get involved in the participatory approaches I mentioned. So there's an ownership issue. They can be quite costly, and they can require quite a lot of time to undertake. And municipal governments or national governments perhaps don't have the funding to meet the required costs. And it is quite a time-consuming exercise, particularly in urban environments where you have a lot of stakeholder engagement challenges. It could also be because there are capacity constraints within governments and local consulting firms. And this could be because there's a lack of regulations and guidelines of how to do SEA, and a lack of capacity building and training as well. Another issue that often crops up is that individual large infrastructure projects might be funded by multiple DFI agencies who perhaps have different agendas and different systems in place. And in the event, then nobody does the SEA. So those are some of the problems and challenges on implementing SEA. So the main question, are environmental and social safeguards effective in informal urban environments? Well, it's a very equivocal answer. It's yes, no, and maybe, because it depends on a number of factors. Project location, the DFIs involved. As I said, some of them have they don't have environmental and social safeguard systems at all. Politics and political will, the strength of the NGOs, and particularly the strengths, and here I'm talking about the funding, the capacity and the status of national environmental authorities. Too often they are underfunded, undercapacitated, very low status within the national government to drive through a process, particularly around environmental and social safeguards. And the capacity of local authorities to plan, implement and enforce city planning guidelines and things like SEAs, and of course funding. So the recommendations, there's really a strong advocacy here for SEA as a proactive and participatory tool, particularly at local municipal level. There really needs to be more advocacy and capacity building within DFIs to promote the use of SEAs, including funding, and funding to support national authorities and administrations in how to do SEA, and how for local environmental consultants of how to conduct SEAs. In addition, needs to be an increase in focus, particularly on the post-ESIA project implementation phase. A lot of time and effort and goes into the ESIA process, and in my view, too little emphasis is placed on the post-ESIA phase during the implementation. Some of the things here that can help would be more accurate budgeting for mitigation measures, so that there's a more accurate budget for environmental and social safeguards in the loan agreements. Those budgets need to be ring-fenced, and expenditure on environmental and social mitigation measures need to be audited by the DFIs to make sure that the expenditure is being spent on environmental and social mitigation and not on other things. As I mentioned, there's a need to strengthen the capacity of national environmental authorities to allow them to carry out compliance auditing and apply meaningful penalties, and to advocate to the DFIs to provide greater support for implementation by the national authorities and by themselves. So in conclusion, there is no excuse for any company, lender or investor to claim to be unaware that their investments can impact upon human rights. We have the environmental and social safeguard systems. They are there. They're mostly in law, but we're not implementing them effectively, and therefore many big infrastructure investments, many city developments are impacting on human rights in spite of the environmental and social safeguards in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryony, for your presentation. Also, Yaw and Julian, for your contributions to this session. And thank you all for joining us for this second session of Think Big 2050 City Megagrowth.